Good afternoon. I'd like to go ahead and take this time to look at the rise and fall of Richard Nixon. The Richard M. Nixon administration, which would take place from January 20th, 1969 to August 9th, 1974, is viewed by many historians as a dramatic Shakespearean play. The main character, with all of their success, all of their failures, and all of their controversies, makes a crucial error, and from that error comes a dramatic fall from power. Prior to his political service, Nixon had served his country during the Second World War, primarily in the Pacific Theater, and as many others, including John F. Kennedy, he would use his military service to help launch his political career. Nixon would serve in the House of Representatives for the state of California from January 3rd, 1947 to November 30th, 1950, and he would then be elected to the Senate and serve as a senator for the state of California from December 1st, 1950 to January 1st, 1953. During his time in Congress, Nixon would earn the reputation as a hatchet man against the spread of communism around the world and here at home. As you recall, Nixon was heavily involved in the Alger Hiss espionage case after World War II. In fact, Nixon would become so popular by the 1950s that when Dwight Eisenhower was looking for a running mate for the vice presidency, Nixon would be added to the ticket. At a distance, Nixon would serve as President Eisenhower's vice president up to January 20th, 1961. In one of the narrowest elections in recent history, Vice President Richard M. Nixon lost the presidential election in 1960 to Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy would win the election with 303 electoral votes compared to that of Nixon's 219. 2 years after Nixon lost the presidential election of 1960, he lost a gubernatorial election in the state of California to Pat Brown, the Democratic candidate. The 1960s represented one of the most turbulent and heartbreaking years in American history. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. President Lyndon Johnson decided that due to his failed efforts regarding the Vietnam War, that he would not seek re-election in 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, and Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968 after winning the presidential primary in California at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. Even though Richard Nixon had publicly and personally stated that he would bring an end to his political career after the loss of the gubernatorial race in 1962, Richard M. Nixon would decide to run for the presidency in 1968. With the support of what was referred to as the silent majority, which were people who wanted the United States to come out of the Vietnam War, but on American terms, not the terms of the North Vietnamese, were also against the anti-war protests throughout the nation, and who were also against dodging the draft. So with the support of the silent majority, who argued in favor of all three of those things, Nixon would win the election with 301 electoral votes compared to the 191 electoral votes earned by Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate. For the time, it was completely unheard of for a politician to lose a federal race, like the presidential race of 1960, lose a state race, like the gubernatorial race of California in 1962, and then somehow win a federal election, like the presidential election of 1968. But that would be the case with Richard M. Nixon. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. The Environmental Protection Agency that would be proposed on July 9, 1970, and would begin operations on December 2nd, 1970, would come about due to the efforts of President Nixon. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency's top priority, was to ensure that human and environmental health was taken care of. It aimed to preserve and conserve natural resources, regulate manufacturing, distribution, and the processing of goods, and also enforcing fines, and at times forcing industrial plants and factories to shut down if they did not comply with the federal government's requirements. Next, we're going to look at opening diplomatic and trade relations with China, late 1971 and early 1972. President Richard M. Nixon would be the first president since the Second World War to call for a détente, an easing of Cold War tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. He would also be the first president to acknowledge China as a communist country after the success of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 and 1950. Although a very controversial decision at the time, Nixon argued the following, that in 1972, China may not be a dominating country of the world, but by the turn of the century, China will be a dominating global power. And for the United States not to open up diplomatic and trade relations with China now, when it had the opportunity, would simply be irresponsible. Not only would Nixon acknowledge China as a communist country, but he would also open up diplomatic and trade relations between the United States and China. Next, we're going to talk about the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that's agreed to on May 26, 1972. As part of Nixon's administration's efforts to ease the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union would both agree to sign an anti-ballistic missile treaty that would limit the number of anti-ballistic missiles that a country could create, and even where tests could or could not take place. Now we're going to look at the de-escalation and America's removal from the Vietnam War. As Richard Nixon was running for the presidency in 1968, he appealed to many, especially a group known as the Silent Majority, because he pledged to de-escalate America's involvement in the Vietnam War in a way that was favorable for the United States. Although President Nixon would slowly reduce the number of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, as you recall, during the Johnson administration, there was approximately 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Although he would de-escalate the number of American soldiers in Vietnam, he would also escalate America's involvement in the war and at the same time expand the war itself when he decided to launch what was referred to as Operation Menu. Operation Menu, or America's bombing invasion of Cambodia, would take place from March 18, 1969 to May 26, 1970. Nixon aimed to bomb various areas of eastern Cambodia in which he argued were providing the armies of northern Vietnam with resources and supplies in order for them to continue fighting against American forces. Historians argue that Nixon's decision to bomb Cambodia represents one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency and of world history. On May 4th, 1970, 4 college students who were enrolled at Kent State University were killed and 9 other college students were injured when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on the college students as they were protesting against Nixon's decision to bomb Cambodia and Nixon's decisions regarding the Vietnam War as a whole. Nixon launched another bombing raid upon eastern Cambodia beginning on May 19, 1970, and all the way to August, that would last all the way to August 15, 1973. This raid is referred to as the Operation Freedom Deal, and because of Nixon's controversial decisions, Operation Menu and Operation Freedom Deal being the controversial decisions, Congress would later pass what was known as the War Powers Resolution. The United States would finally withdraw from the Vietnam War on August 15, 1973, approximately 2 years after American forces were pulled out of Vietnam. The capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to North Vietnam and the spread of communism. The Vietnam War would be responsible for over 1,353,000 casualties, both military and civilian, and the United States would suffer the loss of 282,000 casualties. Now we're going to look at the Watergate scandal. On June 17, 1972, a group of burglars were arrested while attempting to break into the National Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. After they were arrested, it soon was revealed that one of the burglars, James McCord, was a member of CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. Once the press became aware of that fact, 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, became convinced that there was a direct connection between the burglary and Richard M. Nixon. It is crucial to note that Richard Nixon had a very turbulent relationship with the U.S. media, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, after a series of highly confidential documents pertaining to the Vietnam War were released to the public. Those papers would soon be known as the Pentagon Papers. Regarding the presidential election of 1972, historians have had a hard time wrapping their minds around Nixon's decision to commit a crime and then cover up the crime to ensure a second term, because being an experienced politician, Nixon should have known that it would be impossible for him to lose the presidential election of 1972. Senator Ted Kennedy, who had tossed around the idea of running for the presidency in 1972, who is also a Democrat, had destroyed his chances of ever becoming elected as a president due to a car accident that resulted in the death of a young lady by the name of Mary Jo Kopechne on the island of Chappaquiddick. The young lady drowned after Kennedy drove his car off of a bridge after leaving a party. Kennedy's delay in reporting the accident, along with questions surrounding the party, surrounding his relationship with Mary Jo Kopechne, really drew a lot of suspicion from many Americans, and he would never be elected president, no matter how many times he would run for president. And Senator George McGovern from South Dakota, another Democratic candidate, could not hold a light to Richard Nixon's political experience and/or career. Nixon should have known that he had won the election of 1972 prior to counting the votes. However, it appears that this was not the case. Although Nixon would be reelected in November of 1972 against Democratic candidate George McGovern, a Senate investigation would be launched in early 1973. John Dean, who was Nixon's former White House counsel, would testify that Nixon had played a direct role in orchestrating the crime, covering up the White House's involvement in the crime, and had actually recorded conversations that had taken place in the Oval Office. It was later revealed that the reason why Nixon had recorded conversations was because Nixon was going to use those conversations to try to justify his decisions in regards to the Vietnam War after the fact. In fact, it wasn't really anything new for a president to record their conversations. We definitely know that Eisenhower recorded conversations. We know that Kennedy recorded conversations. Johnson recorded conversations. But what's interesting with Nixon is that Nixon, when he first came into the presidency, he actually took out the tape recording system. And whenever things grew more and more tense in regards to Vietnam, he decided to put the taping system back in place. And as it turns out, not only did those tapes catch conversations in regards to Vietnam, but they caught conversations in regards to many other things, most notably Watergate. After Dean's testimony and after learning about possible recordings, the Senate was convinced that Richard Nixon was involved in one way or another. The question that was asked was simply, what did the president know and when did he know? Congress then demanded that Richard Nixon hand the tapes over for review. Their request was denied by Nixon as he tried to argue that the tapes and the conversations that they recorded were protected as part of executive privilege. As a result of Nixon's refusal, the House of Representatives soon decided to impeach President Nixon in July of 1974, and before the Senate could remove Nixon from office, he resigned on August 9, 1974. It is important to remember that it was not the Democratic Party that forced Nixon to resign, but it was, in fact, Nixon's own party. It was the Republican-controlled Senate that eventually said, we've had enough, we can no longer stand and support you, the time has come, now you need to resign from office. The Republicans simply could not stand anymore. According to the Constitution, if the president resigns from office, then the vice president absorbs that position so that the country is never without leadership. So that's the theory behind, that's the theory, is that if something happens to the president, then the vice president steps in. If something happens to that vice president, then you're going to see the Speaker of the House step in. So you always have some type of leadership. The country would never be left with no leadership. As it turns out, Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, was also found guilty and convicted of several crimes. And Nixon would soon replace Agnew with a very newly appointed vice president, Gerald Ford, who had served as Nixon's vice president from 1973 to 1974. So a very new appointed vice president. The Watergate scandal would be responsible for the conviction of many within the Nixon administration. In an effort to get the country past the Watergate scandal, President Ford decided to pardon Richard Nixon for the crimes that he committed against the United States. As you can imagine, this would destroy Ford's political reputation because to many Americans, it would seem as though Ford had pardoned the one person who was responsible for committing the greatest political crime against the United States in the entire 20th century. Although the Watergate scandal, after the Watergate scandal, Americans would lose a significant amount of confidence within their federal government, and especially within the presidency. Nixon taught the country a difficult lesson that just because one is elected president does not mean that one is of impeccable character, does not mean that one holds high morals, does not mean that one is incapable of committing a crime against the country that one had sworn to protect. So I hope this has provided you with more information in regards to the Nixon presidency. And other than that, thank you for your time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time. Bye.